Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. Good afternoon to everyone if you're in India or east of here, and good morning if you're in Europe or west of here. Thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to have three great speakers and friends of the Ananta Aspen Center for this session. I'll briefly introduce both our speakers who are with us now, and we hope to be joined a little later by our third speaker from Germany. We're delighted to have with us Dr. Akihiko Tanaka. Dr. Tanaka is the president of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. And he's a leading academic leader, has held many key academic leadership positions in the past at the University of Tokyo, has many books out, both in English and in Japanese. Tanaka-san, we are delighted to have you with us. Ambassador ONG Keng Yong is the Executive Deputy Chairman of the School of International Studies at NTU in Singapore, and has had a very distinguished diplomatic career representing Singapore in leading nations around the world. And we're delighted to have with us as well Mr. Elmar Brok. Mr. Elmar Brok is based in Germany. He's a senior fellow of the Aspen Institute in Germany, a co-chairman of the Transatlantic Policy Network, and the vice chairman of the World Christian Democratic Alliance. And before that, he was a member of the European Parliament for many years, I think for almost 4 decades, Mr. Brok. So thank you all for being with us. And we look forward to a very stimulating discussion today. We're going to, a few logistic points before we move into the session. We'll begin the session with a 50-minute moderated discussion. And then we will follow that up with a 25-minute Q&A session. So for our audience, please do send in your questions throughout the session. You don't need to wait till the end. And we will take up your questions during the second half of the session. If you're watching this session on Zoom, please use the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen. And if you're on Facebook, please write your questions in the comments section. These questions will be coordinated for me as always by Harshit, who does a superb job of putting the same questions together and coordinating them for our Q&A session later on. I'll begin with a few introductory comments, and then we're actually going to go straight into discussion. Our session is called Leadership Post-COVID, Veni, Vidi, Vici. And now, that for those of you in the world like me, who get their Latin and Roman history from Asterix, I know that this means I came, I saw, I conquered, and I assume that when Kiran came up with this title, she was talking about the coronavirus, because it has come, it has seen, and it has conquered everywhere. And it has had an unprecedented effect. This is a word that is overused in history, but this is one time when unprecedented really applies. It's had an unprecedented health effect in terms of the extent of countries that have been affected, pretty well every country in the world, the extent of populations within countries that have been affected, and unprecedented also in the response that governments have taken, whether this response has been in the form of lockdowns of various stringency, which has led to in many ways a shutdown of economic activity across economies, or an unprecedented again in the degree of support that governments have come forward with to support their populations and to support earnings, employment, economic activity in their countries. So unprecedented in every respect. What we thought we would do today is to talk about the world post-COVID. Because as we move ahead, we need to start thinking about what kind of world we want and how we can get back to that kind of world as quickly as we can. And all four of us in this session are deep believers in international collaboration, deep believers in the merit of coordinating and collaborating responses between countries. And we are deep believers in the world being better off and being able to get back quicker and faster and better with collaboration than doing everything independently on our own. Because as the virus spread, we saw a world that became more and more inward looking. We saw countries to protect themselves, given that the virus generally came in from overseas. We saw countries to protect themselves, close off their borders, try to become as self-reliant as they possibly could in their own local supply chains, and indeed also in many cases try to look out for their own interests, their own immediate health interests, to provide a degree of healthcare as best they could for their own populations. And this then has led to a world that is much less collaborative, much less communicative. And this has been precisely at a time when we have been missing true high quality international leadership as we'd somehow become accustomed during previous global crises. In previous crises, we generally become used to, in particular, the United States, the president of the US playing a leading role of getting countries together, getting a discussion going, and forming some kind of a coordinated response to the particular international crisis. For reasons that everyone knows, that's just not been on offer this time through. And as a result, each country has gone about things as best they can on their own. How do we handle this going forward? We can't just rely on a desired outcome in the November election in the US. There must be more that we can do as countries that believe in an international system, that believe in a rules-based international order, that believe in multilateral institutions. There must be more that we can do to collaborate amongst ourselves such that we can move things for our countries and for the world more broadly in a desirable direction. That's what we want to discuss today. How can we collaborate internationally? How can we coordinate internationally? And what does this desire to collaborate and coordinate mean when we deal with any particular issues? And we're going to address this question by dealing with some very specific points. And we'll start with those specific points, and then we'll get more and more general. And I'll give you a sense of where we're going by giving you two of those points. At the most specific end will be, how do we deal with the production and distribution of a COVID vaccine? And because we're clear that the world will be better off with a coordinated and collaborative approach instead of a every country for itself approach. And at the other end of the scale, over the last 25 years, the world has seen amazing progress in the reduction of poverty and in the substantial improvement of development objectives for wide sections of populations across countries and continents. Um, how can we ensure that the next 25 years looks at least as good, um, in terms of these fundamental human outcomes, um, and maybe even better than the last 25 years? Again, it's going to take great international coordination and collaboration. And then we have a couple of other issues that we'll talk about as well as we go along. So my fellow panelists have very kindly agreed that we can go straight into discussion. And so we'll start with the question on vaccines and the competition for vaccines, the competition for producing and administering vaccines, and the alternative to every country for itself approach. What's right if we have an internationally coordinated, collaborating world? What's the best way of going about producing and distributing vaccines? And we will go around for each of our questions around all our three great panelists, because we'll have, I think, a very diverse perspective, in terms of geography, certainly, but a diverse perspective also in terms of disciplinary backgrounds, professional backgrounds, which I think will all be most insightful. So let me start with this first point of how do we deal. The world is hopefully going to have a vaccine sometime in the next 3 to 6 months. I think the most optimistic scenarios say that we should have some vaccines coming through at least phase 2 trials within the next 3 months. And we should have vaccines available for wider rollout, whether that's in the form of a speeded up phase 3 distribution, or whether that's in the form of post phase 3. We don't know yet. Depends on the results that we find. But the world should have a high potential, at least a few high potential candidates as vaccines within the next 3 to 6 months. If we have this high potential candidate, what's the best way of dealing with it in an international sense, in an internationally collaborative sense? Let me start, if it's okay with you, Tanaka-san, and then we'll move south to Singapore and then west to Germany. So Tanaka-san, first, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Forbes, for kindly inviting me to join this great panel. And really, under the current unprecedented crisis of COVID-19 pandemic, I think most immediate concern for us to worry about in the future, under which we have some sort of hope of having vaccines. But so far, each country is on its own, trying everything to secure the amount of successful vaccines for their nationals. The Japanese government approached some of the pharmaceutical companies and research centers who are most promising in its developing and testing of its effectiveness and safety, but to try to secure a significant amount of vaccines necessary for the Japanese. And well, given the financial promise that the Japanese government can make, I anticipate that there may be some, way of securing certain amount for the Japanese. But then even that, we are beginning to discuss who are the priority segment of population among the Japanese. And now I think most apparent consensus is that we have to emphasize what we call the essential workers, securing the health and fighting against the COVID-19, and those who are most vulnerable, those in the older age and those who have a sickness already. But this is a domestic discussion. And as Dr. Forbes mentioned, we need to discuss what would be the equitable way to distribute effective and safe vaccines to those who are in need globally. I think we would urge all governments to try to figure out the international consortium. I think in the sector of health, since the beginning of the 21st century, there was an example of a global fund to cope with malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS. And this attempt of global fund has been quite successful in distributing necessary medicines to those who are suffering from these three infectious diseases. I think we need to create a similar attempt, or maybe adding the function to the Global Fund to distribute necessary vaccines to the areas, particularly in the developing world, who are in need of vaccines. Well, with this, that's my initial thought.
Thank you, Tanaka-san. We'll loop back and talk a little bit about also, how would such a fund get created, and who would coordinate the creation of it, and how could countries come together to foster such an initiative? So, absolutely. I'll go next to Ambassador ONG Keng Yong in Singapore.
Oh, thank you. And I just built on Mr. Tanaka's earlier comments by adding two additional points. One is that although we all are hopeful to develop the relevant vaccines, there is now a tendency for more nationalistic approach to look at the availability of vaccine and the distribution of the vaccine. So as a preemptive measure, we should try to emphasize more cooperation across different countries and maybe acting more what we call regionally. For example, in Southeast Asia, we are working with our ASEAN member states. As you know, in Southeast Asia, the regional organization is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in short, ASEAN. And we have been talking with each other, mapping out various options. How do we work together to ensure that the vaccine, when they come, will be available to the less developed economies in our region, as well as those that do not have a superb health and distribution system, because we want to make sure that all of us who need the vaccine can access it. So we promote this idea of vaccine multilateralism, and we are hoping that ASEAN as a regional body will play a bigger role to execute the access to vaccine when the vaccine actually comes into the market. The second point is really about preparing for a longer term healthcare arrangement. We are dealing with what we call a emergency situation here, and luckily for us, ASEAN, we have some experience from the earlier crisis, particularly the SARS crisis of 2003 and 2004. So we are working with our dialogue partners, particularly those in Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, China, to pre-position what we call stockpiles of medical supplies and medication, which eventually will also include vaccine, so that we can have a quick response to a sudden upsurge of infection, third wave or fourth wave or infection, whatever. Yeah, but by doing so, we basically organize a regional approach to handling emergency situation, having the relevant material ready, in this case, the medicine and the personal protective gear to help our frontline workers. So in ASEAN context, a lot of discussion has been going on with regard to vaccine as well as pre-positioning the stockpile. Yeah. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. So moving next to Mr. Brok, and Mr. Brok, one of the most interesting things that's happened in these last 5 or 6 months has been, first how in the initial shock of countries having to deal with the spread of the infection, it seemed like the responses within member states of the EU was largely national. It was largely each country trying to address its own immediate health concerns. But it seems like in the last 3 or 4 weeks, there's been much greater talk of collaboration, and there's indeed been a very attractive deal announced for fiscal support that would be provided across the EU over the next 5 years. So it seems like things are coming together at the EU level. And do you see that extending to the vaccine? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Usual shyness. Thank you very much. Must say that it's not just in 3-4 weeks. I think we had this purely regional national approach in the first few weeks, and then it came to a European solution. Nobody was really prepared. That was one of the reasons for that we can, that everyone tried to do its best at home, but it's seen very early that is counterproductive. So Germany, for example, took in, after a few weeks already, very bad cases from Italy and France in our hospitals, and others did the same, and so on. And we had already a very early program for the first economic needs for short-term workers, for middle-sized companies, of 540 billion euros already in May. The second package, which is 750 billion euros, was that what you mentioned about. The economic reasons for that is that the European internal market is so integrated that an economic recovery cannot be done by one member country alone. Germany relies totally on the internal market, but also the other countries, all the value and distribution chains and so on and so forth, and this was understood. Therefore, we had a program which was never such a big one in the history of the European Union as this time. The second point is with the vaccines. Here's a cooperation in the Council of Health Ministers in the European Union. There is partly also money from these projects, which is given for the sustainability of health systems. And there's also agreements between member countries and others on the European level for the support of research and checking possible vaccines, and also for ordering amounts. A few weeks ago, even Germany has ordered 300 billion from a certain countries. Germany has only 80 million inhabitants, so it ordered already a lot of vaccines to help others. But here we need, I think, a more international approach. When I remember, for example, that in the AIDS question, we needed 10, 15 years until such medicaments could be given to Africa, then it's a moral disaster of the world. And this we have to avoid. And therefore, we have to strengthen here, as you mentioned, Ms. Dr. Forbes, in the very beginning. We have to see that the international cooperation, that the American president is going on to destroy the WHO. It's a disaster in this question. We need such international levels from the United Nations level whatsoever to come to such cooperation that the poorer parts of this world, poorer parts of our societies and poorer parts, regional parts like Africa and other places in South America can have the vaccine so fast as anybody else. If we have a situation in this world that there's a fight about vaccines, and that some parts of the world have to wait for 3 or 6 months longer, or even longer than other parts, it will have an incredible negative impact on the relationship in this world. And I think here we have to come to closer cooperation in order to bring that into order.
So, both, I think, Ambassador and you, Mr. Brok, have spoken about the existing institutional mechanisms, regional mechanisms that exist. The EU, of course, with a very strong governance mechanism, a very strong mechanism now, over many decades of economic integration, and then going well beyond. And then the ASEAN network of 10 economies in Southeast Asia, which again is primarily economic focused, but is now demonstrating that it is moving beyond that to wider member country interests. What do we do for the world? How do we go beyond our regional groupings to something that would help the world, that would coordinate things worldwide? Because could the EU and ASEAN get together and pick up countries along the way? It's what's the who needs to make the first move? Anyone who would like to go first? Yeah.
Well, I think I just want to follow up Mr. Brooks' reference to WHO. Yeah, as an international organization handling health issues, it is the logical choice to do this role, to perform this role that you mentioned, Naushad. It has the network in the countries throughout the world, and also the relevant mandate, because it is the World Health Organization, and every countries in the world subscribe to the WHO work. So I think an important ingredient to ensure that vaccine is available throughout the globe is to work with the WHO and rely on its network and its own goodwill and connection to make sure that those who are not directly in the diplomacy for assessing vaccine will not be left out. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Tanaka-san. Yes.
Yes, I think WHO is a logical international organization that should take initiative in ensuring that as many people as possible in the world have opportunity to get vaccines. But I think under the current circumstances, probably we need some sort of a coalition of willing countries that could be ready to supply necessary financial resources, because distribution of vaccines require fund. And well, in the case of Global Fund that was created in the first decade of 21st century, that was initiated by G7 process. And I think a lot of international civil service organizations, civil society organizations like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others agreed to create a fund which is associated with the United Nations. And so I think maybe WHO take initiatives, solicit the coalition of willing countries to supply fund, and the mechanism be quickly made under the auspices of the United Nations.
Mr. Brok, any further comments?
Well, it's true that WHO should here have a certain leadership, but also the idea of regional cooperation or cooperation of the willing is a good one. The European Commission has organized, I think 2 months ago, a donors conference for international donors conference in fighting COVID-19. And in the first round, they got together 7.5 billion euros for that. And I think this should be used for such purposes of such cooperation in order to make the possible vaccine available so fast as possible. And I think at that moment, if the vaccine is there, we should help also by such corporations of richer countries and international institutions that we have from the very beginning the production capacities. Probably we have to build up different production capacities. Even at the end of the game, we do not need one of them because the vaccine is not the right one, but just in case to have it available, as it was done. Mr. Hoyer, who is the president of the European Investment Bank, had told me that he had some experience in that because he coordinated the fight against Ebola on such a level. And there are certain examples for that we can do that. But I'm afraid that I do not see that as a real coordinated way because we have some countries, some powerful countries in this world who do not like to have international cooperation in this question.
Yeah, and it's so I think that's precisely when we were talking just now, we've actually I think made a more powerful argument in favor of multilateral institutions than is generally made. In that when we talk about multilateral institutions, we usually talk about what needs to be fixed with them, but if we think of what the mandate of the WHO, as you pointed out, is exactly to address situations like the current one, and it's such a powerful role, and it says it brings home in a very real way the role of what a multilateral institution must play, and the role that the wider and more powerful international world must play in supporting multilateral institutions in them playing that role, even if they have flaws, even if they aren't perfect in what they do and how they do it. Thank you. We move on to another question, and this is many countries. I mean, Singapore is a good example, but many countries. France is the world's largest tourist destination is France. Many countries rely on travel and tourism as one of their major sources of economic livelihood, but not just of economic activity. It employs millions of people across the world. And we've got used to a world where we used to take travel for granted. We probably traveled too much, but we took it for granted, and it was something that we could just do without having to plan, in a very complex way. How do we get back to that kind of world in a coordinated way? Because again, each country coming up with its own protocols for who's allowed in, what are the requirements of quarantines, should you be tested before you leave your home country? Is there a system for mutual trust in the testing that's done in other countries, such that travel becomes something that is more feasible? Again, it's another area where we can go so much faster and further with international collaboration and coordination. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what form that international collaboration and coordination could take going forward. Because governments today are, we know that a minority of most countries travel abroad. I think the exception is the Dutch. But except for the Dutch, less than half of the population, typically of a country, well under half, travels abroad in any particular year. So there's a greater stake that populations have in wanting to be safe, even if that means that no one's allowed to travel in or travel out. So how do we restore travel? How do we restore our tourism industries in a coordinated way? This time, let me start with you, Ambassador ONG Keng Yong, because Singapore is a country which is very reliant on travel. It's very reliant on not just tourism, but very reliant on being a regional and world headquarters for many companies that wish to trade around the region. And travel is inherent to Singapore's long-term prosperity.
Yeah, thank you. I think what we are trying to do today in Singapore is we take country by country, because at the moment we don't have a format for application across different countries. Even if we in Singapore can develop that format, the countries concerned on the other side may not accept what we propose. So we have now developed an arrangement with Malaysia, which is just 30 minutes by car across the border. Yeah. And Singapore and Malaysia, we rely on each other's business and human resources significantly. So we are able to say that we have two sets of arrangement where we allow the regular visitors in essential services to go back and forth, and there are certain restrictive protocol, but when you are required to travel in and out for your work and for family, I think you will have to go through this kind of conditionality. We just started this with Malaysia. We hope it will work. And then later we have to apply this across to other ASEAN member states. Yeah. As you rightly pointed out, tourism and air travel, hospitality sector are a very important part of our region. They have actually contributed to the fast reduction of poverty in all our less developed economies in Southeast Asia. So we want to take this sector back into business as usual, as quickly as possible. One of the things that we are doing also with Japan, as you mentioned, Singapore is a city for multinational operation, not really in Singapore, but in the surrounding Southeast Asian region. So we have many Japanese expatriates living here in Singapore and with their families, and they travel almost every day to neighboring countries for their business and other networking activities. So we have mapped out a set of acceptable arrangement with the Japanese authorities, and in the coming weeks, we hope to implement them. Basically, all these arrangements require two things. One, we require a confident level, a trust between the two sides that we take care of our respective testing system, our preventive measures, because we don't want to infect other people, or we don't want infection to come into our respective territories. So the level of trust is very essential. Yeah. Secondly, there must also be a certain reasonableness. I mean, we can say we quarantine X and Y for X number of days, but if you come here for a short one-day meeting, you stay 7 days in quarantine, and then when you reach home, you stay another 7 days in quarantine. It makes no sense. So what we have to do now is to work out something reasonably acceptable to the health authorities on both sides, as well as to the business sector and the society at large. But what is important is that we are on the move, and in some cases, we will probably have to take the risk involved. But we have to calculate the risk. If there is a minimal level of infection in another country or in another city, and there are adequate safeguards, I think we are better to look at how we can move ahead. So the discussions are ongoing. Some of the air flights have started to move back into schedule. Yeah, although the aeroplanes are still very empty. Yeah, but we are going by trial and error, as we say. Ultimately, as I underlined just now, the level of trust in each other's what I call control protocol and health system must be there.
Thank you. Go to you next, Mr. Brok, because I think the EU has actually put some things together. So yeah, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I think we have to see that we have all to change our habits, and traveling is part of it. We have a sad moment today in our family. My mother-in-law becomes today 100 years old, and we had to cancel the big planned birthday party. So life has changed. This traveling, I think, as just was said, we have to trust each other. That is a big condition for that. Transparency. It's a key word. Only if a country is transparent, you can trust the country and can make deals with that to open the borders. I think that is a very important question we have to see. And here we see also some problems in certain countries where this trust cannot be given for the moment. And here we have to work on. Further on, we have to look for joint data or goals. For example, in Germany, we have a situation that a district can be closed if there's more 50 new infections per day on 100,000 inhabitants. Other countries in Europe have it with 30. Already you have a problem with traveling because you have different standards. How can we come to joint standards in such a question that it makes the life easier? But nevertheless, we were able in the European Union, not just in Germany, but in the European Union, to regionalize the problem. We do not close whole countries anymore when in a country is a problem. We close parts of a country. We say, please do not travel to Paris at the moment, but nobody says do not travel to Lyon. So that we have the way that you warn your citizens to go somewhere where the danger is very high, but not close the whole country to others. And this, I think, is good in way of freedom, but also an important question in developing business again, that business people can travel to each other. So we learn week by week certain conditions which make it possible to concentrate more on certain measures and not to make it broadly to everyone. And here, I think, should we see that we can do it perhaps also to more and more countries outside Europe.
Thank you. Tanaka-san?
Well, how to reopen our borders, how to restart a physical movement of people on a massive scale is really a great challenge in the coming months. I think in EU, I think because of the, connected over land and sense of solidarity amongst the people, the governments went ahead with allowing movement of people for vacation holidays. And this is really a admirable attempt, and I understand that the lessons that EU, European countries will accumulate will be a great benefits to the rest of the world. Well, in a country like island country like Japan, we after the end of state of emergency, we reopened interprefectural travels, but international travels, we are virtually completely isolated, with a very, very limited exceptions. And what we are currently anticipating, because of the need of people's movement, as Ambassador ONG Keng Yong mentioned, what the Japanese government is doing, a sort of one-on-one approach, having an agreement with the counterpart country one-on-one, and making reciprocal demands and make similar, a system so that they could exchange people on that basis. Even that there's a difficulty, because how much PCR tests you would require before leaving the country, and how much PCR tests you will require on arrival, and how long the quarantine period will be. And so these things should be worked out one-on-one. And then, to somewhat more detail, when you say PCR tests, what kind of PCR tests you require each other had to be determined. And but then there is a danger of this one-on-one approach. It's like establishing a bilateral trade agreement, with everybody, and then will this combined bilateral agreements produce coherent, whole, consistent, systematic, efficient, and safe? That's, when we deal with trade agreements, the reason why we set up WTO is because we need to have multilateral system. Otherwise, you would have what the economists said, the spaghetti effect. We may end up with a spaghetti effect of international travel protocols, which may not give the trust very much. And so I think on this too, we need to start, I think, multilateral discussion as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I think, what the earlier question, we talked about the importance of WHO because a multilateral institution exists to deal with such a situation. In the travel area, there probably isn't a multilateral institution. There are multilateral institutions, but not one tasked with this broad area of responsibility of travel protocols. So very much, thank you. We'll now move on to a broader area, and I'm going to actually weave in a question from that's come in, two questions that have come in from two different participants around the whole question of China, and it's how does the world deal with a rapidly rising, stronger, more assertive China? We, of course, as you know, have our own problems in India on our northern border. We share a very long border with China, 3,500 kilometer border. And we have, but we've not been alone in the recent disputes that we've had on our border. Taiwan has been under greater pressure by China. Hong Kong, of course, has been under much greater pressure from China, and with the new security law that's been passed, the Philippines and Indonesia have had issues with islands off their coasts. Japan has a long-running dispute with China going back many decades. So how do we deal with the rise of a new superpower, which is becoming much more assertive? Is there a role for international collaboration? And I'm not even referring to the U.S.-China dispute, some of which is partisan, but the general sense is that regardless of whether we have a Republican or a Democratic administration post-November, the general sense is that the concerns over China and the confrontation with China will continue in a substantial form. So, how do we is there a role for international collaboration in setting some rules again for what's okay and what's not okay in the rise of a more assertive China?
Naushad,
yeah.
I don't think that we have to worry too much about the political side of things, because one of the significant development from the COVID-19 is the question of relying on a single point for manufacturing vaccines and other kind of essential goods. Remember when we first started this COVID-19 crisis, there was a scramble for face masks. Yeah. And when we look at where we can produce a face mask, we say, yeah, we can do it here, we can do it there. But unfortunately, most of the material needed for producing a face mask come from one point, namely China. So the lesson learned from the last 6 months is that we will have to move away from such a kind of dangerous arrangement where China is a factory for the world, and all the supply chain, the production chain, transport chain, all revolve around it. I feel that going forward, the big issue with the COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 is how can we do a new arrangement which have China still as part of an important economic location. Yeah, its economy is huge and it's important, but other additional location, other countries, other economies will come into play. Yeah. So if this actually takes place, we will see a gradual but significant adjustment of the global economic activities, and there will be subsequently an impact on other part of the Chinese government and Chinese economy, Chinese society. Because the reason why it has become so assertive is because of its growth, of its perception that it has become a world a power that the world has to reckon with. Yeah, and I feel that this is a very big challenge for the Chinese authorities. They have to now think through the strength of the Chinese governance is provision of economic goods. And if the world feel that it is not reliable to depend entirely on the Chinese production location, adjustment will have to be made. And if so, what will be the impact on the economic growth of China? And following that, what will be the impact on the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party in providing welfare, well-being, and so on for the Chinese people? So I think looking forward down the road, we are already seeing more investments in different parts of Southeast Asia. I don't know about India, but also investments from Southeast Asia together with their partners from other developed economies. They are moving to Africa. And overall, what I suspect will happen is that more and more will move towards less dependable, less dependence on Chinese factories and Chinese production. So this is important for the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Brok, you know, one of the, you know, Germany has a very, Germany in particular has a very strong trading relationship with China. Do you see a similar move to diversify that relationship away from China, particularly in terms of, you know, as a source, as a supplier?
Yes, that's true. But first I have to say Germany has no power anymore to arrange its trade relations because it's purely competence of the European Union. Germany cannot make any trade agreement with anybody else in this world anymore. And therefore it's
good member of parliament, yes.
No, but it's just true. That's one of our strengths we have because of that the European Union is the strongest trading power of the world. When you look into by far, and this has to be seen, and only when we use this together powerful, we have an impact on countries like United States or China, and we have to use that instrument much more as we have done it before. The second point is, yes, there is COVID-19, but other reasons have brought us to the belief that we have to look in certain cases, especially when it's strategic goods. It's not just the questions of artificial intelligence questions, other security questions, energy questions, but I give you a simple example, what I myself learned only, that 90% of our ingredients you need for antibiotica, pharmaceuticals, are done in China. So having such a dependence on one country makes me afraid, makes us afraid. And therefore, I think it's a new discussion in Europe that in certain strategic important parts, we should have our own possibilities, not to rely totally on international trade. Here we have to be very careful that this is not overdone, because if we do it we would overdo it, then it would be against international trade. Then it becomes protectionism. So they have to concentrate in certain fields. And what we have to look to, and here I believe there should be a closer cooperation between all the countries who are in favor of rule-based multinational trade framework, to build a 3G, as Secretary General Guterres has once mentioned it. It means that the United States and China are the two Gs who are in a fight with each other, which has a bad results for all of us. I think if Japan and the European Union, we have no a joint trade agreement. If India and European Union and India and Japan develop such relationships. We have done it now, but not ratified it yet with Latin America, with Australia. All these countries work on common standards so long WTO is not effective because of reasons you know, the effectiveness is stopped at the moment, that we have such a 3G movement of all the such countries of cooperation, of setting common standards, then I think it has an impact that all of us are protected by cooperation.
Thank you. You know, Tanaka-san, I'll turn to you for the same question, but I'll focus it a bit with the question that's come in just now, which is, you know, where there was a question around the point that Mr. Brok made just now about 90% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that are used in Europe, that are used in the US. In India's case, it's 70%. And the fear is that this could be used as even a strategic issue, you know, and how does one deal with this as a, you know, is it domestic sourcing as, or at least continent-wise sourcing, as Mr. Brok mentioned for Europe, or are there other ways forward?
Well, thank you. That's a very valid question. But on this issue, I think it is really the crux of the matter is trust. Can we trust China? And that is the question. And on this you know, issue, I believe China missed the golden opportunity to establish its the trust in the international community after the inception of the COVID-19 pandemic. I believe the Chinese deeds after the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic actually increased a lot more apprehension in the rest of the world. You know, in South China Sea, the Chinese ship, you know, targeted radar at the Philippine ship in February, and Chinese Coast Guard ship sunk a Vietnamese fishing boat in April. And around that same time, China kept sending its Coast Guard ships more frequently to the Senkaku Islands, which Japanese claim its sovereignty. And China had a terrible conflict with India. And then, you know, to an Australian prime minister who simply suggested investigation of the origin of COVID-19, China raised the tariff 80% over barley from Australia. And then in the midst of this, China introduced national security law in Hong Kong and urging Hong Kong authorities to arrest the democratic movement people as well as the owner of a newspaper, Apple Daily. And I think China, I think, tried to utilize this moment by donating face masks. And that's good. But then it appears Chinese rhetoric doesn't give the rest of the world who are suffering from the pandemic much confidence, because no matter when China sent the masks, the Chinese diplomats require recipients to make a huge amount of words of gratitude and praise the Chinese, the superiority of Chinese system. And that, I think, you know, really created the trust issue. Can we trust this country for essential goods? I think if China, you know, many countries can trust China, then maybe, you know, you don't have to worry so much about the 90% reliance on the face mask productions or materials. So I think as long as this trust issue continues, we have to think about some other mechanism to protect us in the period of a crisis. And I think I hope the Chinese leaders now realize that they botched its diplomacy in the COVID-19 pandemic, and think twice and how to convince the rest of the world to have a trust on the Chinese. I think this is an enormous task, but I hope the Chinese leaders should really think about that. But then in the meantime, to the extent that we believe there should be some relocation of essential goods, products, and resources away from a single source, and then actually, you know, self-reliance is not an answer. I think Singapore cannot be self-reliant on everything, and Japan either. And so what we should do is to create, you know, efficient and hopefully sufficient supply networks among those who we can trust each other. And then I believe that there are a significant number of countries who we can trust each other. And as Mr. Brok mentioned, that Japan had a very good economic partnership agreement with the EU, and we have TPP, including Singapore. And so I think among the global supply chain, somehow we need to explore, you know, what would be the great areas of relocations. And then to guide this, I think we can rely on the existing framework.
Thank you, Tanaka-san. Thank you. So, you know, the last question, and this is drawing on two of the questions that have come in again. And one of the last theme that we wished to touch on too in our discussion is the question around broad human development goals, anti-poverty programs, global growth. You know, as we said earlier on, in the last 25 years, you know, more people have been lifted out of poverty in the world than at any previous era in human history. And the great concern going forward over the next 25 years is that a world that is much more inward looking, much less outward oriented, much less interested in the well-being of other countries, will be a world that does not make that kind of substantive progress in the next 25 years. So, you know, what are your thoughts on how international collaboration, international, you know, like-minded countries working together again with countries that one can trust, as Tanaka-san said just now with respect to trading with China, how can countries that are like-minded establish again that same momentum, that same ability to develop and deliver on one's one's broader goals of lifting people out of poverty. I'll start with you, Mr. Brok, this time.
Always, when it becomes difficult, you start with me. No, thank you very much.
Questions were easy.
No, thank you very much. I think the basis should be the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, where the international community has set the standards and what have to be done, but we have to look who does what, in which context and how much. If I see, for example, the Chinese Africa policy, then it looks to me a little bit more like a new colonial policy with new instruments, and not as a development for independent African countries to make their own life. And here we have to look also in the political structures behind that, and here we have to look in the common standards in that question. And but I believe that the international order, I think it was mentioned in the beginning of this debate, has helped us that we have less poor people now than 20 years ago. Globalization had partly good results. And here we have to see such developments, but how can we do it in regions where you have not a political structures that they internally can make their part of that? And here I think we have to come to a totally new concept of classical development policy. Development policy was aid, but we have to do, how can we provide security in such regions? Only if security, if you see, for example, Nigeria, one of the richest countries of this world because of terrorism and because of corruption, the people are poor. And here we have to be helpful to provide security, to help them to clean up. We have to see how can we come to fairer trade agreements, which most of us do not have until now. European Union including have to do more for fair trade agreements. So the definition of stability and development must be made much broader than we were used to that in the past. And I believe that he also should cooperation between Japan, between India, between Asian countries, Asia, ASEAN, between ASEAN and the European Union to do that. And I hope after November we can include again the United States in such a policy. And here I think that the strong parts of this world should see more their responsibility. Then we have to see one point, and that it makes me so nervous, that at the moment, the United Nations are not very good in practice. That might have to do with need of certain internal reforms, but more when it comes to decisions. Then one of the main veto powers, China, Russia, or the United States, puts a veto. That the United Nations, because of these veto powers, cannot in the implementation of such a policy very successful, which is a catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brok. Tanaka-san?
Thank you very much. I think as Dr. Forbes mentioned, that the global community has made a tremendous achievement in the first and second part of the decades of the 21st century, and achieving the goal of Millennium Development Goal, halving the number of extreme poor from 1990 to 2015. And based on that, the international community agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. And the #1 goal is the eradication of poverty. And that is, I think, now in danger because of the inward-looking tendency of many of the rich countries. I think international cooperation is essential. And then here again, the logical international organization that has to play an important role is the United Nations. And so we encourage the UN organization to persuade all member countries to realize that SDGs are still important even under the COVID-19. But then here, you know, I have to mention my hope of democratic victory in the November in the United States. And well, if the United States is still the largest provider of international cooperation, and so I think if once the United States comes back to join the international effort of poverty eradication, we could, I think, at least work out some workable plans, because the EU, despite the current difficulties, I can trust very much that EU has long been, EU and EU member countries has long been the leaders of development cooperation. I agree with Mr. Brok that we may need to reconceive of the traditional development assistance, but still EU is the leader, and EU member countries have been the leader. And then we could rely on the wisdom accumulated by Southeast Asian countries and South Asian countries to get out of, to help poor countries to get out of their conditions of extreme poverty. I think, you know, Indian current efforts of improved sanitation is a great way of reduce extreme poverty, supplying basic water and improving primary health care. And that, I think, would be mobilized by the international cooperation, not just the rich countries, but all you know, developing countries that have accumulated good practices and better practices. I think in the coming years, what is called South-South cooperation in improving the people's condition of sustainability really crucial. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanaka-san. The last word to Ambassador Keng Yong.
Thank you, Naushad. I wanted to make one particular point that I thought is important for us going forward. Really, at the end of the day, if you look at what has we achieved in the past 2 decades, there is this sense of confidence, there is this sense of dynamism, there is this sense of wonderful connectivity, and we have technology that come to make all our travels and business and life even easier and very comfortable if we apply the technology for the purpose they are designed to do. So going forward, I think it is important for countries small and big to re-establish that sense of confidence. Right now, everything is so uncertain. We depend on the US presidential election. We depend on China's more generous approach to the South China Sea territorial disputes. We depend on whatever somebody else has to do. Yeah, and even in fighting COVID-19, we still have to cajole everybody to do certain protocol and to take care of themselves. So there is no sense of confidence and certainty going forward. And that is no good for us. Business and the development of our social well-being and coming together to fight all this climate change and other kind of threats require us to be confident of ourselves and confidence of the other side also playing its part. So I think I would say that we have to accept that we are in a multipolar world now. And number two, we have to avoid believing that one side must win and the other side has to lose. Yeah. And number three, I think a case has already been made that some of the rules in certain international organizations have to be adjusted in order to take into account the realities of the world today. It is no longer just United States of America and the Soviet Union, which is no more. Today, we have the United States, we have the European Union, yeah, we have China, we have India, yeah. And according to a latest study I saw this morning, the economic growth in Europe retrenched between 10 to 20%. I think I should put it this way. The GDP growth in Europe following the COVID-19 varies from minus 10% to minus 20%. Yeah. So, the United States of America is also seeing economic growth slowing down, China also. So to bring us back to pre-COVID days, I think going forward, we need to have economic growth of 5 to 10% in order to get us to the level of December 2019. How can that be achieved without confidence and without certainty? Yeah. So I feel that going forward, whatever we do about vaccine development, whatever we do about combating COVID-19 and supply chain and what have you, we have to try to find that magic that allow us to have the confidence and the dynamism to bring ourselves back into a positive level. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to try to summarize points. I'm going to make instead one overarching comment, which is building on the comments that you've just made, which is the importance of collaboration, the importance of coming together and having like-minded goals, and those like-minded goals translating into action, and of like-minded countries coming together to do work, to sign up voluntarily, maybe, to what's right, to sign up bilaterally in some cases, and to sign up regionally, and then to start getting maybe regional groupings to collaborate together with other regional groupings or individual countries. But I think the words that have been used today are a great guide to what good should look like going ahead. You know, the words that were used, words like fairness, words like development, words like equity, words like collaboration, trust, transparency, these confidence, these are the words that should really determine how we work together and how we get back on the growth path, on the path of spreading development across countries and populations, and all those immediate tasks that we have of an equitable mechanism for distributing vaccines, an equitable way of getting travel and tourism moving again, and getting back to the world that we all knew one day. So I will simply end by thanking you all for being such a wonderful panel. Mr. Brok, Ambassador Tanaka-san, thank you for your great insights. It's been a great pleasure, and thank you, our audience, for being a very good audience. So Thank you all.
How do we know?
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Tanaka-san. Thank you, Mr. Brok.
Ambassador, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador and Professor Tanaka. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Naushad.
Dr. Forbes.
Bye-bye. Bye, Ambassador. See you soon.
See you soon, yeah.
Yes, bye. Bye.